In addition to the clear clash of ideologies, there were also practical considerations, not the least of which were the two federal garrisons that were positioned in Confederate states. What was to be done about Fort Pickens at Pensacola, Florida, and Fort Sumter, which lay in Charleston Harbor? The Star of the West, a merchant Navy ship, had already tried to deliver supplies to the Sumter garrison during January 1861. But shellfire from shore batteries, manned by cadets from the Military College of South Carolina, had forced them to return home with their cargo undelivered. Feelings in both the North and South were running high, and their positions became more intractable and more polarized with every passing day. Fort Sumter, in particular, began to take on great symbolic significance. For the South, it was an affront to have a federal military installation in the very heart of the Confederacy. South Carolina had, after all, been the first state to secede. For the North, the prospect of abandoning the fort voluntarily was unthinkable. And so Lincoln made a fateful decision. The garrison would be relieved under the strictest orders that it should use force only if it came under fire from the South Carolinians, as the previous relief expedition had done. Lincoln was determined to absolve himself of any responsibility for firing the first shot in any armed showdown. By now, however, a political solution to the showdown was nigh on impossible, although several attempts to reach a compromise were tried. The game of brinkmanship was about to end. The South had accepted that only the bullet and the cannon shell would settle the matter. It was a view probably widely held by many in the North. With the Northern Relief Convoy due to arrive on April the 11th, the Confederates demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter. On April 10th, Major Robert Anderson, the federal commander, refused. But the garrison had only a few days' worth of supplies remaining, as few as 3 or 4 days, according to Confederate reckoning. What if the relief expedition was some kind of federal trick? The Confederate commanders asked themselves, why wait until it arrived and take the chance? So it was that at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces began the bombardment of the federal garrison at Fort Sumter, and the first shots of the American Civil War were fired.
The first shot of the Civil War was fired by a white-haired old fiery Virginia secessionist named Edmund Ruffin. He was 67 years old, long white hair down to here. And he felt that the first shot of the Confederacy should be a shot of honor, and he was going to fire it. In Fort Sumter, Anderson's second in command was Abner Doubleday. Doubleday was lying in bed in his quarters in Fort Sumter, and about 4:30 in the morning, Ruffin's first shot crashes into the fort and buries itself in the wall about 2 feet above Doubleday's head. So I think Doubleday probably stayed in bed for a little while longer. Certainly, the Federals didn't even begin returning the Confederate fire for another 2 hours. But they were completely outgunned. They had no mortars in the fort. They had no fuses for their cannons. And meanwhile, the Confederate fire had just been building and building and building.
In all, Fort Sumter took more than 600 direct hits during the 34-hour artillery bombardment. No Federal soldier was killed or even seriously hurt. The fort itself, though, took a battering. Realizing the hopelessness of the garrison's position, Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter on April 13th, and he and his men were allowed to leave aboard the ships of the Federal Relief Expedition.
The bombardment and surrender of Fort Sumter provides the clear military casus belli that makes the Civil War into a war. There had to be some trigger, the shot heard round the world for this war. And Fort Sumter provides that trigger.